1973, millions of men went to bed mentally ill and woke up cured. No treatment, no surgery, no breakthrough. A committee met in a room and cast a vote. And overnight, a condition that had destroyed careers, ended marriages, justified forced institutionalization, and driven men to the edge of their own lives was crossed out of a book, not because science had changed, because the vote had. The men who had been diagnosed, stripped of custody, fired from jobs, medicated into silence on the authority of that page, were never told. Nobody apologized. The diagnosis simply disappeared, and the men it had already crushed were left holding the wreckage of a life broken by a disease that was never a disease. It was a line in a book, written in pencil, by a committee, and erased when the politics no longer required it. Now ask yourself a question nobody in that committee ever had to answer. If a disease can be voted out of existence, if a condition that justified decades of suffering can be erased by a show of hands in a conference room, was it ever a disease, or was it a tool? And if it was a tool, who was it built to control? And why did nobody ask that question while the damage was still being done? And here is the question underneath that question, the one that should sit in a man's stomach like a stone. If one diagnosis was political, how many others in that book are political? How many conditions that are currently being treated, currently being medicated, currently being used to dismiss a man's perception in a courtroom or a custody hearing or a conversation with his own family, how many of those will be voted out in the next edition? And when they are, will anyone apologize to the men and women who were diagnosed with a disorder that turned out to be a paragraph someone decided to delete? That book is still in print, 5th edition. Every edition before this one contained diagnoses the current edition no longer recognizes as real. The book does not describe what is wrong with people. It defines what is wrong with people. And the distance between those two things is the distance between medicine and control. Machiavelli would have understood this book immediately. Not as science, as legislation. Because the man who writes the definitions writes the law, and the law does not need to be fair. It needs to be enforced. And this book has been enforced on every man, every woman, every population that ever became inconvenient to the system holding the pen. An intelligent man who has watched a word land on him after he did something entirely reasonable, a man who set a boundary and was called cold, who raised a concern and was called paranoid, who showed emotion after months of composure and was told he was unstable, that man knows this architecture from the inside, not from a textbook. From a kitchen table at 10 o'clock on a Thursday, when the person across from him responded to his point by diagnosing his tone, the boundary was never addressed. The frustration was never examined. His reaction became the subject, and the person who caused the reaction sat in perfect stillness and watched the room decide who the reasonable one was, without a single fact being discussed. The voice that used to engage now observes. The reply that used to address what he said now addresses how he said it, and the silence after the exchange is not resolution. It is the sound of a man wondering whether his anger is the problem when his anger was the only sane response in the room. A man who has been gaslit for setting boundaries will feel this in his chest before his brain catches up. And here is where this stops being a personal problem and becomes something that should keep a thinking man awake at night. This weapon does not land equally. A white man walks into a building and commits an act of violence that dominates headlines. Within hours, the word arrives. Troubled, disturbed, mentally ill, lone wolf. Ask yourself why the system reaches for a diagnosis before the blood is dry. Not to excuse what was done, but to contain it. to seal the act inside one individual so the culture, the ideology, the structures that shaped him are never examined. He is sick, the system is healthy. Machiavelli called this the localization of blame. The prince who can contain the failure in one body protects the body of the state. The diagnosis is a quarantine, and the quarantine is not medical. It is political. Now, a man with darker skin commits the same act in the same country, and the word changes. Not troubled, not mentally ill, suspected terrorist, radicalized, same behavior. Different diagnosis. Why? Because the first diagnosis contracts, it shrinks the event into individual pathology. The second expands, stretches it across an entire community, an entire faith. One man's violence is a medical anomaly. Another man's violence is a civilizational threat. The weapon is identical. The direction changes based on what the system needs the public to believe next. And nobody in any newsroom has ever been required to explain why the same act earns two different words depending on who committed it. That question is never asked on camera. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself who benefits from the question never being asked. And then ask yourself whether the system that controls those words has ever once used the same editing power on the words it puts on you. And a black woman who sets boundaries with the same firmness that would earn a man in a different body the word assertive is given a different label. Angry, difficult, the angry black woman. A diagnosis so embedded in the culture, it does not require a physician or a manual. It lives in the reflex of every room she enters. Her clarity is relabeled before she finishes her sentence. Her intelligence is reclassified as hostility before her first point lands. And the architecture is identical. Give a response, a name that sounds like a condition, and the condition replaces the content. The boundary disappears, the woman remains, diagnosed, unheard. And here is the question nobody in that room ever has to answer: what specific word was inaccurate? What specific boundary was unreasonable? The question is never asked, because the label does not need evidence. It needs volume. And a room that has already decided someone is angry does not stop to check whether the anger was justified. It just removes the battery. This is not politics. This is the same weapon operating at every scale, from the geopolitical headline to the kitchen table. The label changes depending on the skin, the gender, the proximity to power. The architecture does not. And a man who only sees this weapon when it is aimed at him has seen one face of a machine with 100 faces. The machine has a lineage, and the lineage should make the blood in a man's body change temperature. Because once he sees how old this weapon is, he will stop believing the person who used it on him last Tuesday invented it by accident. In 1851, a physician named Samuel Cartwright published a diagnosis for freedom. He called it drapetomania, the madness of wanting to escape. A human being in chains assessed their situation with total clarity and chose to run. And the system reclassified that courage as a psychiatric disorder. The cure was mutilation, framed as treatment. Ask yourself what kind of system needs a medical term for the desire to be free. What does it tell you about every institution that accepted the term without question? And what does it tell you about yourself that you were never taught this in any classroom, that this piece of architecture was erased from your education as cleanly as the diagnosis was erased from the DSM? Cartwright was not a fringe figure. His paper was reprinted and distributed as medical guidance. And here is where Machiavelli becomes essential, because Cartwright did not just invent a diagnosis. He invented an absolution. The diagnosis made the oppressor the caretaker. Men who considered themselves moral could enforce an immoral system and sleep well. They were not crushing people. They were treating a condition. The diagnosis did not just control the target, it cleansed the person delivering it. Machiavelli observed that the prince who can dress cruelty in the language of necessity will never be opposed. His subjects will thank him for the cruelty. Cartwright dressed it in the language of medicine, and the institution thanked him for 200 years. Ask yourself, is there anyone in your life right now who has diagnosed your clearest perception and walked away feeling righteous about it? Not guilty. Righteous, concerned, helpful. That is the absolution mechanism, and it has not changed since 1851. The same architecture. Women who displayed independence or anger were diagnosed with hysteria, from the Greek for womb. A woman who argued was not heard. She was diagnosed. The treatments were institutional confinement and surgical procedures, not punishment, medicine, for a disease that was never a disease. It was a boundary the system refused to respect, reclassified as a symptom the system could treat. Ask yourself, if a man's boundary is called leadership and a woman's identical boundary is called a disorder, is the difference medical, or is the difference about who was holding the pen when the definition was written? A woman watching this, or the sharp woman in a man's life who has been telling him something he was not ready to hear, she saw this architecture before the word Machiavelli entered his vocabulary. Her pattern recognition is field intelligence. Centuries of direct exposure. The man who dismisses it because he only just arrived at the architecture is still running someone else's code. Soviet dissidents were not imprisoned. They were hospitalized. Diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia, a condition so vague any act of resistance qualified. A prisoner is a martyr. A patient is dismissed. And here is the part that should make a man reassess every argument he has ever lost. To someone calmer than him, once a man is diagnosed, every response confirms the diagnosis. Articulate, delusional, calm, flat affect, angry, agitated. Every door locked from the other side by the same hand that wrote the label on the door. The framework was airtight from the inside. No behavior could disprove the diagnosis because the diagnosis was designed to absorb every behavior as evidence. Ask yourself, have you been inside this room? Not in a Soviet hospital, in a relationship, in a family dynamic. There was an exchange where nothing you said could land correctly. Agreement was compliance. Disagreement was aggression. Silence was avoidance. Emotion was instability, and you walked out wondering if you were the problem. You were not the problem. You were in the room, and the room was designed by someone who needed your confusion more than they needed your clarity. Now ask the question that separates the man who watches this video from the man who is changed by it. The people writing these labels, Cartwright, the Soviet psychiatrists, the committee that voted a disease out of existence, the culture that calls a black woman angry for the same behavior it calls a white man decisive, have any of them ever applied the diagnostic framework to themselves? Cartwright never asked what disorder might cause a man to enslave another human being. The Soviets never examined the mental health of a government that feared questions. The room that diagnoses a woman's clarity as anger has never diagnosed its own fragility. The diagnostic lens points in one direction, always toward the person whose behavior is inconvenient to the person holding the pen, never the other way. And nobody has ever been required to explain why. This is architecture, and the architecture has a name: the diagnosis weapon. The diagnosis weapon is the technique by which a person, an institution, or a system does not argue with a man's perception, but reclassifies it. They do not say he is wrong. They say he is unwell. They do not counter his evidence. They diagnose his need to present it. And here is the Machiavellian principle that makes this the most efficient control mechanism ever designed. The weapon does not require the diagnosis to be true. It requires the target to wonder if it might be, not belief, doubt. That is the threshold, and it is lower than any man thinks. A man who wonders whether his anger is legitimate hesitates before expressing it. A man who wonders whether his boundaries are reasonable softens them. A man who wonders whether his perception is accurate defers to someone else's version. And the person who planted the doubt does not need to control him after that. He controls himself on their behalf, for free. Ask yourself how many times in the last year you censored a perception not because it was wrong, but because expressing it would have earned you a label you could not afford. That censorship is the product, not the side effect. The product. And someone is profiting from it. Machiavelli observed that the prince who never needs to use force is the prince who has made his subjects enforce themselves. That is the diagnosis weapon at kitchen table scale. It does not chain a man, it gives him a reason to chain himself. And the reason always sounds compassionate. You are overreacting. You are too sensitive. You are paranoid. The chain is a word, and the word does not need to be accurate. It needs to be expensive, because a man who has been charged once does not wait to be charged again. He adjusts, he softens, he calls the adjustment growth. And the person who deployed the word watches the adjustment and calls it progress. Both of them are using therapeutic language. Neither of them is describing what actually happened. The weapon does not need to hit every target. It needs the target to watch someone else get hit. Cartwright needed the institution to classify escape as illness, so every person who considered running weighed freedom against a label. The Soviets needed the public to see the hospital and understand what happened to men who spoke. One example is enough. The rest adjust on their own. The diagnosis weapon does not require a diagnosis that is true. It requires a diagnosis that is expensive. Expensive enough that a man changes his behavior to avoid receiving it. And the behavior he changes is always the behavior that threatened the person holding the pen. One sentence. Lifetime warranty. The cost of deployment is a word. The return on investment is years of self-correction from a man who was never broken. There is a second mechanism underneath this. It operates at closer range kitchens, offices, friendships that function only when one person stays useful, and it is called the symptom inversion. A man raises his voice after months of being dismissed. He is aggressive, checks the details of a story because 3 facts changed between Tuesday and Thursday. He is controlling, withdraws from a friendship that only works when he is available. He is avoidant, cold, afraid of intimacy. The response is separated from the context that produced it. The context disappears. The response, stripped of its cause, looks pathological. Remove the fire, and the man running from the building looks delusional. That is the symptom inversion. It does not require a lie. It requires an edit. An intelligent man who has felt this will recognize what comes next. There was a conversation recent, specific, where his response made perfect sense inside the situation. But the situation was never discussed afterwards, only his response. His raised voice quoted for weeks. The thing that raised it never mentioned again. He started apologizing for the fire escape instead of asking who lit the match. And the person who lit the match accepted the apology with the composure of someone who had been waiting for it. Ask yourself, in how many arguments did the person who started the fire end up receiving the apology? And how many times did you walk away believing you owed it? The symptom inversion crops the photograph, shows the jury a man's face without showing them what he was looking at. The prosecution and the editor are the same hand, and a man convicted on a cropped photograph does not know the full image exists. Machiavelli observed that the prince who controls the definition of virtue controls the behavior of every man who wants to be called virtuous. The person who controls the definition of sane controls the behavior of every man who fears being called otherwise, and the fear of the label is more powerful than the label itself. Called aggressive, once a man moderates himself 100 times to avoid hearing the word again. One diagnosis, lifetime warranty. Ask yourself, how many words are you currently moderating yourself around? How many labels have you accepted without once asking the person who delivered them to provide the evidence? And how different would your life look if you had demanded the receipt before you accepted the charge? And now, the turn. A man who has spent this video nodding, seeing how the diagnosis weapon was aimed at him, must sit with something uncomfortable, because the weapon does not only point in one direction. Whose boundary did a man call cold? Whose frustration did he label dramatic? Whose tears did he reclassify as manipulation, because sitting with the possibility that he caused them was more uncomfortable than diagnosing the person crying? Whose silence did he call passive-aggressive when it was the most disciplined response available, because the alternative was speaking the truth he was not ready to hear, and being diagnosed for that too? Whose raised voice did he quote in the retelling while leaving out what he said 10 seconds before it was raised? The diagnosis weapon runs in both directions. A man who sees it when it is aimed at him but cannot see it in his own hands is running on code he did not write. The culture that taught vigilance about manipulation also taught him to diagnose the people around him the moment their emotions became inconvenient, and the diagnosis always protects the same thing, not the truth, the comfort of the person delivering it. This is the mirror flip, and the man who flinches is closer to the beginning of something real than the man who scrolls past. The moment a man sees the weapon in his own hands, he can choose to put it down. That choice is the beginning of intelligence that cannot be weaponized, because it was chosen, not installed. But ask yourself, and this is the question this channel will never let you avoid, can you see the weapon in your own hand right now? Not in theory. In the last conversation, where someone you claim to love showed you an emotion that was inconvenient, and you reached for a word instead of reaching for understanding, that word was a diagnosis, and you deployed it with the same calm, the same composure, the same righteous concern as every system this video just exposed. The only difference is scale. The architecture is identical. Type Myra if that changed the direction of the examination. This is the channel where the architecture gets named. Every video, every system. If this video made the weapon visible, subscribe. Not for content, for the operating system underneath every conversation where a man's clearest perception was reclassified as his deepest dysfunction. A weapon a man can name is a weapon he can dismantle. A weapon he cannot name dismantles him. There is a cost to seeing clearly. It has a name. The sanity tax. The sanity tax is the price a man pays for maintaining his perception in a system that profits from his doubt. Machiavelli described this position without flinching. The man who sees the architecture and speaks it will be opposed. Not because he is wrong, because he is expensive. His clarity costs the system more than his silence saves it. Every whistleblower in history paid the sanity tax. Every dissident told he was paranoid. Every man who drew a line and watched the room reclassify him as the problem. The cost is not the label. The cost is the quarantine. People do not argue with the diagnosed man. They avoid him. Stand near the man who was called crazy, and the label might transfer. Nobody wants to catch it. So the man who sees clearly speaks truth in an empty room. Not because the room was empty when he arrived, because the diagnosis cleared it. Ask yourself who left your room, and did they leave because you were wrong, or did they leave because being near the truth was more expensive than being comfortable in the lie? He is not difficult. He is accurate. He is not paranoid. He is early. He is the smoke detector that fires before anyone smells the burning. And the response of every person in the building is not to check for fire. It is to remove the battery. Then, when the building burns, nobody remembers who sounded the alarm. They remember who was annoying about it. There is a video on this channel about the 7 levels of intelligence, and level 2, the peacock, is the level most targeted by the diagnosis weapon, because the peacock is visible. Visibility is the first thing this weapon targets. The man who shows what he sees is the man who gets told he is seeing things. Here is what a man does with this. Not motivational. Operational. When someone responds to perception by diagnosing it, restate the original point that was never addressed. The diagnosis weapon requires the target to fight on the terrain of his mental state. Refuse the terrain. Return to the content. The person who moved the conversation from content to condition moved it because the content was a threat. Reattach the context. When someone says overreacting, make them finish the sentence. Overreacting to what? Force the cause back into the room. Say it out loud. The diagnosis collapses the moment the facts it was sitting on become visible. Ask yourself, has anyone ever told you that you were overreacting and then refused to name what you were reacting to? That refusal is not an oversight. That refusal is the architecture. The missing context is not forgotten. It is removed. And it is removed because the context is the evidence. And the evidence does not support the diagnosis. Read the calm. Machiavelli observed that the most effective aggressor provokes the reaction, then presents himself as the injured party. Calm is not always innocence. Sometimes calm is preparation. An intelligent man will recognize this, the last argument that ended with an apology, not for what was said, but for how it was said. The content vanished. The delivery became the verdict. The person who provoked the delivery walked away with the moral high ground and the original offense unchallenged. That is the diagnosis weapon in formal dress. Demand the evidence underneath the label. Called paranoid, ask what specific observation was factually inaccurate. Called controlling, ask what specific boundary was unreasonable. Force the word to stand trial on its own facts. A word without evidence is a weapon with no ammunition. Accept the sanity tax. Some people will call a man difficult, paranoid, too intense, not because he is any of these things, but because his perception makes their performance uncomfortable. A man who dulls his clarity to avoid the cost of seeing clearly has chosen the most expensive blindness available because he chose it himself and called it peace. Type awake if the weapon is visible now. Type taxed if the cost has been paid for years and the cost never had a name until this moment. Drapetomania, hysteria, sluggish schizophrenia, the angry black woman, the lone wolf. 3 centuries. 5 labels. 1 architecture. A healthy response reclassified, so the system that provoked it walks away unexamined. Every civilization that needed silent compliance from a population it could not physically restrain used the same tool. Not chains. Not guns. A word. And the man who accepted the word did not need to be restrained. He restrained himself because the diagnosis made him believe the door was locked. The door was never locked. It was never even closed. The system dressed his clarity in a hospital gown, and he sedated it himself. He furnished the room, called it growth, called it healing, called it maturity. And the system that locked nothing watched him build a life inside a room he could leave at any time, and called that obedience wellness. Reach for the handle. This is your cold awakening.